Good afternoon. At least it's afternoon from where I sit. Chad Whelan is my name. I'm from Deakin University. Joining me in this session today, my two colleagues from Deakin University, Lennon Chang and James Martin. Also joining us today is Cassandra Cross from QUT, as you can see from her virtual background, and Tom Holt, who has an even better background. We're going to be having three presentations, then leading up to a more panel-like discussion where we'll be reflecting on themes that have come through each of the presentations and touching on some of the more critical political and policy-related issues at the present time. I come to you from Australia, so many of these talks are going to have an Australian focus, but they will be touching on themes relevant to the region in which Australia sits, and many of the issues that we get to later on are, of course, global in nature. The title of our session, which has just again disappeared from my screen, is from virtual kidnapping to cyber extortion, Australian and regional perspectives. First up to speak to us today is Lennon. Over to you.
Thanks, Chad. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the land where I come from, and pay respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. Today I'll be talking about virtual kidnapping. Let me share my screen first. So as Chad just mentioned, I'm Lennon Chang. I'm an associate professor in cyber risk and policy at the Center of Cyber Resilience and Trust at Deakin University. And this paper is actually going to be published as a book chapter and on COVID and the pandemic and online scam. And it's great to see both of the series editor, Cass and Holt, Thomas Holt, are here. And today the topic I'm going to talk about is virtual kidnapping online scam with Asian characteristic during the pandemic. Do you still see my screen?
We do, yes.
Yep, great. So this is a paper co-authored with two of my PhD students, Monash, Mr. Doyle and Mr. Do Pan. So what's virtual kidnapping? I'll just quickly show a video on what virtual kidnapping is about. I'll probably need to swap my sharing and reshare again. Sorry for all the so here.
Bound, gagged and clearly in distress, this is a faked kidnapping. The victim is the subject of a scam. Police are calling it virtual kidnapping. Fraudsters ruthlessly preying on Chinese international students in Australia to extort them and their families.
If you receive a telephone call that encourages you to deposit money into a bank account by a person who's pretending to be from a position of authority in China or another location, don't pay any money. Either hang the phone up, call the police, or call your university.
The level of sophistication of the scam and the distress caused has police very concerned. Accused of committing a crime, the victim is threatened with deportation if they don't pay a fee. Or victims may even be coerced into isolating themselves in a hotel room and supplying scammers with pictures faking their own kidnapping. Distressed families in China are then more vulnerable to complying with demands for large ransom amounts.
They're clearly encouraging people to not call the police, so we're not finding out about it till the money's been paid, and it's just trial and error on their part.
8 cases of virtual kidnapping have been uncovered in New South Wales. While most ransom demands have ranged between $20,000 to $500,000, one parent in China handed over $2 million to save his daughter in Sydney.
It's more emotional trauma that's caused on the student family because they will be seeing pictures of students who hold themselves ransom in the hotel room. I think that's horrible to any parents.
More than 212,000 international students are enrolled to study in the state. Police are issuing warnings in language to encourage other victims to come forward.
Being ashamed of...
Or I'll stop it here. Let me change it back to the PowerPoint. Yeah, so it's just give you some ideas about what virtual kidnapping is. So it's never a real kidnapping. It's actually have the students force the students to join the actions that groups are asking them to do. So it is a fraud scheme in which scammers manipulate fake kidnapping for ransom or through non-contact ways. So in terms of virtual kidnapping, you can see there are two forms of victims. The one that is the victim who are virtually kidnapped, the students who receive the phone call and trying to follow all the instructions by the pretended authorities. And the one who pay the ransoms are usually their parents who are far away, mostly in China, in Taiwan. We see cases in other countries as well. Here, one of the key things is the victim's information. When the parents trying to, when the scammers trying to contact the parents, they need to have the information of the kids. They need to give as detailed information as possible so that the parents overseas, outside Australia or even in outside US, will know will start to believe in those scammers and follow the instructions of the scammers. But where are this information come from? It can be randomly come from a phone call. As most of Australians will know, there might be a phone call from Amazon telling you a DHL telling you your parcel wasn't be able to be delivered, and if you follow the instructions, they'll link you to the Chinese embassy telling you that, well, you're telling the students that they're involved in some type of crime. So in order to protect them, they need to follow the instructions, and they're going to put them in a safe place and during the time for the investigation. So this is more randomly getting the information from the students itself. But on the other side, we also see that the scammers are using the information they collect from the data leaked, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And it helps the scammers to build up their connections or their trust with the potential victims, both the students and the parents. So what they were trying to do for the virtual kidnapping, what they're trying to do is they try to block the communication between the virtual kidnapped and their family members. So when the family members receive information, they won't be able to get in contact with the students and cause a certain type of distress and worry, so that the parents will follow the instruction. So although there are no physical harms, we rarely see the case that the students are harmed, but the impact could be catastrophic. So when we talk about virtual kidnapping, actually have a long history. It's nothing new. It's just like evolve through the technology. So back in the 1980s, 1990s, we can see virtual kidnapping happening during those period of time. What they'll do is they're trying to call the parents at home and try to fake the sound of the kids and tell. It's very much like what we're seeing in Western society now, calling for help, asking mom or dad for help. But in those days, we'll see there's no internet at the time, so most of the virtual kidnapping was done through a mobile phone. And the information they get are actually quite labor involvement. Like apart from randomly calling the parents, they might have a very basic information coming from the letters that they collect from outside of from outside or from the letterbox. And when it comes to digital era, we see more and more information leaking on the cyberspace through hacking or online stalking. So with all this information, so we see the involvement of virtual kidnapping, and at the same time, they try to build up the connection outage, so that the parents will trust that their kids were virtually kidnapped. And now I move into the situation scenario that they have more information, it's easier to build up the trust, especially during the COVID, everyone's at home, lockdown. The parents might not have other ways to really get in touch with the kids if they are virtually kidnapped. So they have the direct manipulate of this relationship and direct involved in the creation of communication disconnections. So they also ask the victims to self-make fake kidnap videos. I'm still trying to figure out how they do this. We've been talking to a couple of students who were trapped in this game, but they are not the ones who really make up the fake videos or fake kidnapping scenarios. But from the video which I just showed you, see some students will follow the instructions and do what the scammers ask them to do, or the fake authorities want them to do. They might be because they are under threat or coerced to do so. So here we try to use few theories to explain this. One, of course, is the routine activity theory. So we're not saying when routine activity theory tells us that a crime happens when a motivated offender meets a suitable target when there's a lack of capable guardians. And suitable targets here will definitely be the students who are more vulnerable to this type of scam. One of the reasons we guess that Chinese students or Taiwanese students are targeted is because in the Chinese culture, it's more following the students might be more obedient to the authorities when they learn this is the phone call from the embassy telling them they're going to protect them during because they're involving in certain type of organized crime. They might just follow the instructions without really double checking whether the phone call is from the embassy or not. Personally, I actually have few experiences talking to them on the phone, but unfortunately, I have no chance to really get through to build trust with them, to let them telling me how they do it. So when I go through all the channels, when they get me into the contact with the so-called embassy people, they'll probably be able to recognize that I'm faking myself to be the student. So also when while we're talking about the suitable targets, we see the students who fall into virtual kidnapping can be explained through the immediate emotional in decision making. This kind of theories actually tell you that they make a decision that they might be opposite to their self-interest, but they can be influenced. Their decision making can be influenced by different scenarios, especially when there's a death threat, a deadline, ask them to make a decision straight away, telling them they're involved in crime. If they are not collaborating, they'll be in trouble. They'll be sent back to China for crime investigation, for prosecution. So students who are here alone by themselves might fear of these kind of scenarios and try to help try to collaborate with the scammers and go to a room that what would be described as a safe place during the investigation. The similarity between virtual kidnapping and online fraud would be that most of this type of crime are aiming to gain financial benefits. So while we're saying if the student following all those scammers to a safe place, we don't usually see it's under coercion, as they don't really want to harm the students. If there's any physical harm, we'll see that it might draw more attention by the law enforcement, and they might not be able to do it again. Of course, for virtual kidnapping or other online fraud, they are all technology facilitated. Technology here plays a very important role, especially during the COVID when we are doing everything online. They create more opportunities for the virtual kidnappers to do so. And both online fraud, especially romance fraud, and virtual kidnapping are manipulative nature. Have the manipulative nature here. They try to manipulate the victims. But different to romance scam, who is more using a positive or I shouldn't say positive, but more positive way of drawing people into this type of scam. Virtual kidnapping is more using a negative way, more coercive, more threatening way to create fear. So to ask those students to follow the instructions. So this is very much into the differences. We see the virtual kidnapping usually cause more financial, they not only cause financial losses, but also physical distress. We see, of course, on romance scam, they have the same situation as well, but the physical distress might not be as strong as the virtual kidnapping. And it utilize high valence negative stimuli. So as I just mentioned, it might use a death threat, crime investigation, or deportation, so that in a way that they will ask the student to follow their instructions. And the pace of the virtual kidnapping are usually more intensive than other type of scam because they need to do it straight away so that they won't be discovered that that's a scam. And the information accuracy is very important for virtual kidnapping, as they will need to build up a trust first. So when they call their parents or relatives back in their home country, they'll be able to gain the trust straight away and get the money. COVID and virtual kidnapping, as I keep emphasizing, we're using the technology more, and we are, especially like in Melbourne, we have been isolated we've been locked down for a much longer time than other countries. So it creates an opportunity for criminals to really target students here in Australia to conduct the virtual kidnapping. And it's just some statistics telling you there's a drastic increase of virtual kidnapping during the period of time. And we see the target are mainly Chinese communities during back in the time when during the COVID. So culture and language here played an important role in facilitating the virtual kidnapping and try to lure the students in. And this is we rarely see virtual kidnapping happening to Western societies. One of the argument or contention is that we think Western society students are more trained under critical thinking and not really believe in authority or obey the instructions from the authority. So the cultural difference would cause the virtual kidnapping to be successful to the students who are coming from the more Chinese culture and Chinese background. So as I mentioned earlier, we see the data leaking in China might also contribute to the virtual kidnapping with more precise, accurate personal data. The trust will be built more easy than it used to be. And our research shows that during the COVID period of time, in China, there's a huge increase in terms of identity theft, as well as the data leaking. Will probably some of them you probably know that in China that there was a huge data leaking on Telegram, and people are using those data to conduct crime, as well as sorry, my apologies. So so this kind of data leaking and identity theft will contribute to the virtual kidnapping. That's the problem of working from home. Dogs barking, other noises are coming through. So in terms of dealing with virtual kidnapping, there are a few things we really need to think about. That's not really a huge difference in terms of crime investigation as other online scam, because they're all facing the issue of transnational nature and the issue of underreporting. Virtual kidnapping is especially the same as is especially the case as students are really feel ashamed that they'll be ashamed to share this kind of experiences, and the parents even in China are also ashamed to be telling people that they are the victim of an online scam, a virtual kidnapping. And also during the COVID period of time, the police there are less capacity from the police, and they actually create some investigation issues during the COVID. And of course, when it comes to international collaboration, similar to other type of cybercrime, that's always a huge barrier. For virtual kidnapping, or similar to other type of online scam, we see there's an involvement of different countries here. Well, what we were saying, the virtual kidnappers might the low student who are kidnapped might be in Australia, parents might be in China. The location of the kidnappers will cause it make it even more complicated. We see a lot of news coming through that the kidnappers, the virtual kidnappers, pretended virtual kidnappers or online scammers are now mostly based in Southeast Asia or Africa. The reason why they choose these areas is because there's less capacity for the police to really help in investigation, and the collaboration between the police through among different countries make all the investigation even more difficult. And one of the issues I want to raise here is that while we're saying virtual kidnapping, we identify two victims, but where is the location of the crime would be something that we need to think about in a legal perspective. For example, when we say the kids are kidnapped, the virtual kidnapped that have been put in the so-called hotel room or a safe place according to the scammers, the one who lose the money or the one who are mostly under threat are the ones who are back in China or Taiwan, the one who pay the money. So when it comes to crime investigation, will it be the police in Australia who need to initiate the crime investigation, or should it be the victims, the ones who pay the money back in China? The police in China should initiate the investigation. And if you are collaborating with the police in Australia, would it be seen as a crime in that sense if the one who are paying the money are not really there? You might say, oh, why the students are virtually kidnapped, but if they are not under coercion, they just follow the instructions. It might be a manipulate of their mind, but they are put in a safe place. Could we really call it as a crime? That might be something we need to think about and need to unpack a bit more when we look into the virtual kidnapping issues. We did quickly touch on the problem of underreporting. There's no trust with the police on crime investigation. They think that it would be a waste of time for them to report. Also, the physical impact of victims, they feel ashamed of being blamed. They feel of victim blaming. So this is the culture that we definitely need to change, not only in virtual kidnapping, but also in all sorts of online scam. One of the key things we suggestion we made is to really suggest that a change of attitude towards online scam, encourage the victims to stand up and not doing public shaming. I think I'm running out of time. I'll just quickly go through all these things. one of the key things we need to think about for virtual kidnapping is the crime investigation bit, the lack of capable guardians. Although we might be able Australian government might be able to collaborate with Chinese government in identifying or in identifying this type of crime, but the complexity comes from that they have to go through third countries to collaborate. And if there's a collaboration between the Chinese and Taiwanese online scammers, it makes the scenario more complicated. As we see a lot of online scam in the past through now to virtual kidnapping, most of the scammers are released because there's no sufficient evidence. And it's not because there's no evidence, it's because there's a lacking of collaboration between the governments and law enforcement agencies in that sense, so that they won't be able to collect evidence in a swift, in a timely manner. Let's say there are actually examples of successful collaboration under the Interpol I-24/7 system, and also under the Budapest Convention, the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. And we're sort of, we know, some of you will know that there might be a new UN Convention on Cybercrime, which is under discussion at the moment. Then we think that might, in some sense, help in the future, once it passed, in facilitating the police collaboration on virtual kidnapping or other type of crime. This is one of the successful cases that Interpol news released. We see there are 76 countries involved in this in the crime investigation, in police collaboration, and arrest how many criminals? I can't find it here. Anyway, but what we're saying is, this is although this is an example, we see there is a huge amount of money and a lot of people involved in that, so it drew the attention from different countries, and they are willing to collaborate with each other to combat this type of this online scam. But if there's a minor, I shouldn't say minor, but it only involved certain countries, and the money involved wasn't that big. There might be a concern that the countries involved might not be willing to collaborate with each other, and that might be something that a more structured international collaboration needs to come in. So some recommendations here. I think the first thing is to raise awareness, to really let people know this is happening. And while we're talking about the awareness campaign, we see the police in Australia are trying very hard to pass the information to the students here. But based on our experience interviewing students, we don't really see that they are receiving those messages. Also through the video, we see they try to issue some press release, even in Chinese, in Mandarin. They didn't go through a right channel to pass it down to the right person that they are in need. So how we can design a good awareness campaign activities here, and really let the information be delivered to the people in need, will be something we really need to think about. And this will involve in the design that fits in different cultures and languages. And the other one is, I was saying, most important thing is strengthening the public-private collaboration, maybe to identify the ID spoofing calls, and maybe to stop this kind of online scam. If we really identify the number of the phone call, block them immediately. And the third one is more on the crime investigation bit. Utilizing, we need to utilize both the formal and informal channels. Of course, it's easy to say, but there'll be a lot of things that we really need to unpack in terms of the collaborations here. So I'll stop here. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Lennon. Very interesting talk, and some of the themes around the transnational aspects and the UN Convention will definitely come up in subsequent discussions. Why are Global South countries sort of being chosen by scammers as a hub to conduct these virtual kidnappings?
Oh, thanks, Chad. I think one of the reasons I usually call the online scammers now as a cybercrime nomad. They're actually moving quickly from countries to countries in order to avoid crime investigation. So what we see now is that when the police are identify certain criminal groups in certain countries, while they are collaborating, while they're contacting the police there in the countries to launch crime investigation or to launch some actions, the organized crime syndicates are moving to another country. So one is why, back to your question, why global south, or what, I don't really like this term, but what we said, Southeast Asia countries or countries or developing countries has been selected as the hub for virtual kidnapping or online scam. One of the reasons is that they see the gap there, that the police might not have the capacity. The people in those countries don't really care about online scammers. They might have other priorities. So it's easier for those criminals to see the loophole and select those countries as a location to conduct this kind of scam or crime. James?
Hi, Lennon. Thanks. Yeah, fantastic presentation. My question has to do about the new UN Convention on Cybercrime and whether you think that this will be, maybe a possible solution or useful in some way of addressing this crime problem.
Well, for UN Convention, it will be similar to Budapest Convention. I think one of the beauty of these two conventions is the way the mechanism they try to set up in terms of international police-to-police collaboration. But the issue for our current Budapest Convention, the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, is that China are not really happy to get involved. And based on my previous interview with Chinese police and people experts in China, the main concern they are not involved in is they are not really involved in the drafting of the convention back in those days, and they will see it as a regional convention rather than an international convention. So we see the coming up of the new UN convention. You probably know, based on the background, you probably know who is behind the draft. It's been discussed for a very long time, and in the past 2-3 years, it started to really draw people's attention, and we see more and more stakeholders joining in the drafting of the UN Convention. Someone was telling me that they never see such a draft that comes quickly through UN and UN system. I said no, it's actually, they have been sitting there for more than 10 years, and suddenly people pick it up and pay more attention to it because they see the need of a new convention coming up. Back to your question, whether it will help, I believe at least it would draw the key players in China, and but we will still see a lot of issues relating to the international collaborations, the capacity building that need to be done in developing countries or less developed countries. All the political issues that might become the barrier between countries in crime investigation, as I just mentioned, for example, China, Taiwan, or even like China, US, based on current political atmosphere. So there will still be issues there, but yes, I believe it will in some sense help in the police collaboration in the future if UN Convention can be successfully passed.
Right, thanks, Lennon.
Last question just before we go on to Cassandra from sunny Queensland. Do cultural and regional differences impact the incidence of virtual kidnapping?
Say that again?
In what ways, if any, have you observed cultural and regional differences playing a role here?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned in the presentation, we see it's very much this type of virtual kidnapping is very related to the cultural background of the group of people who get involved. So I usually tease my Australian friends, if you got a phone call from your embassy or from the police, you just ask them to shut up and hang up the call. You won't say, well, I'll follow your instructions. I definitely get involved in certain type of crime. This is a different way of training. In Chinese culture, it's more like let's just train to obey the authorities, to follow what the police tell you. The government is your parents. They are here to protect you. So while they're raised in this kind of ideas, when they get a phone call from the embassy, they'll suddenly feel what is happening here. Should I follow their instructions? But most of them will do so because they are just afraid that they are really in trouble and they will be caught. So my guess is the virtual kidnapping won't really happen in Western society, as the education training will be different, and we don't really have this kind of obedience attitude towards the authorities. So to your answer, yes, there's definitely a cultural differences here. In terms of region, I'm not so sure, but we see the virtual kidnapping mainly happening to international students, and one of the reasons I guess would be that for people who will be able to send students overseas to study, or usually the parents with coming from a rich family, so obviously they'll be following our theories, the best suitable targets here. They are not really targeting people who don't have money, but they're already a self-select group of people overseas that they can really trap them, and they know there are money there. I hope this answers your question, Chad.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you, Lennon. Over to Cassandra from QUT and Thomas from Michigan State in the US. Thanks.
Right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from wherever you're joining. My name is Cassandra Cross, and I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Justice at Queensland University of Technology. And I'm presenting a paper today on data breaches with my co-author, Tom Holt, who's a professor at Michigan State University, coming to us in a very different time zone. So I'm just about to share my screen. I just got a thumbs up from someone that this works. Amazing, thank you. So firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon the lands in which I'm coming from today. So here in Meanjin in Brisbane, I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as First Nations owners, and wish to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Also want to acknowledge the Cybersecurity Research Centre, who funded the survey that Tom and I are talking about today. So just the usual caveats on this, that the views expressed in this are those of Tom and I and don't necessarily represent the Australian government. So today we're talking about data breaches. This is one of my favourite kind of websites. I know that's a little bit nerdy, but world's biggest data breaches and hacks, and it goes back for probably a decade or so. This one was last updated September 22, and I mean, all of us know that data breaches aren't new. They've been happening for a long period of time. This is just a visualization of some of the bigger ones that are happening globally. The bigger the circle, the bigger the data breach. From an Australian perspective, there's one here that's relevant to us, Canva, who's an Australian tech company. It was breached back in 2020, and 139 million customer details were exposed. So that's probably the largest from an Australian perspective of an Australian company. But there's certainly many, and I know there are people that will be part of this presentation that have been caught up in many of these different data breaches. In an Australian context, in the last kind of 6 months, we've had some really significant data breaches occur. So September 2022, We had Optus, which is a telecommunications company, the second largest here in Australia. They were breached and it was estimated to be around 9.8, perhaps even 10 million customer details were exposed in that. A few weeks later, we had Medibank and AHM, which is a medical insurance company. All of their data was exposed, and that's estimated to be around 9.7 million customers. And then earlier this year, company Latitude Financial Services, so that's kind of a short payday loan service, they were exposed and estimated to have breached the details of around 14 million customers. So in an Australian context, we have had some of the largest data breaches in kind of the last 6 to 9 months. And I think it's really galvanised public attention in an Australian context. It's certainly spurred government to, I guess, take some action in this space. What that action looks like is yet to be determined, but there certainly is a lot of talk about that at the moment. In terms of, I guess, reported data breaches, so in Australia, we do have some legislation requiring the reporting of some data breaches, and that's through the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. So the number of notifiable data breaches from 2018 to 2021 here, and we can see, I mean, there's a significant number of data breaches reported every year, but we know that's probably only the tip of the iceberg in terms of organisations not knowing that they have been breached and therefore not reporting, but also around some of the, I guess, limitations to the legislation and not requiring everyone to report. So if we think about a definition of data breaches, we've broadly defined it around the unauthorised access to personal information via a variety of methods. We think about the different types of categories of data that are available. There's payment card information, personal health information, personally identifiable information, trade secrets, and intellectual property. So certainly many of the data breaches that we've seen recently in Australia, there has been those, I guess, first 3 categories have predominantly been exposed as part of those breaches. In terms of data breaches, they can be malicious, unintentional, or accidental. So the large ones, I guess, that we've seen in those 3 examples were malicious. They were groups of threat actors that hacked into or were able to access different servers and download information. But not all data breaches are malicious in that way. Some of them are just unintentional or accidental, such as leaving a laptop on a plane, in a train, at a restaurant. There's many different ways that data can be breached. We did have a really interesting episode in Australia a little while ago where there was a filing cabinet of information that had been dumped at a secondhand store, and inside the filing cabinet was actually a lot of sensitive government records. So that was very much an accidental data breach. It can also occur through online and offline means. So many of them do occur in an online environment. As I just mentioned, the filing cabinet, that was just offline. So in terms of the impact of data breaches, it's probably not surprising to know that there are a variety of consequences for those that do experience one. I guess prominently, it's around identity fraud and identity theft, around having your personal details and information out there for an offender to use. There's potentially embarrassment, depending on the type of information that's been exposed, the potential for loss of reputation for the individuals, but also for the organisations who expose data. There can be physical and emotional decline for individuals who experience this. And in some cases, that can lead to relationship breakdown, depending on, I guess, the severity and scope. I think what's also really important to note is that not all data breaches do result in an actual compromise. So whilst there are millions in those examples, there was nearly 10 million in each and 14 million in the third. Not all of those individuals are going to experience an actual compromise or actually identity fraud or identity theft perpetrated against them. But I guess it's the fear, the constant fear of potential misuse and the uncertainty that can have some really severe detrimental impacts to individuals. It's the not knowing part that can have an impact. As I mentioned, we do have some legislation here in Australia, the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme under the Privacy Act 1988, which I note is currently under review. And it requires organisations with a turnover of more than $3 million to to report. It does include some small business operators, but it also excludes a number, including state, territory government, public universities and public schools. So there is, I guess, a number of conversations about who's in and out in this legislation and I guess the relevance of that moving forward. So what I'm going to present today is some data for a survey that Tom and I did about data breaches and about, I guess, attitudes towards the legislation, but also experiences of data breaches. So our survey had several modules around demographics, around technology use, around the notification scheme we have here in Australia, around the personal experiences of data breaches, the impact and changing views. And I'm going to present just a snapshot of some of this data. Excuse me. So in terms of the survey, we used this particular definition. So we were focused very much around third-party definitions. When an organisation experiences an unauthorised legal loss that causes the loss of a customer's personal information. So we weren't focused on one data breaches where individuals inadvertently expose their information or kind of those accidental, unintentional ones that I spoke of earlier, but we were very much focused on the third party where an organisation is breached. In terms of the survey responses, we had just over 2,000 online responses that were collected during September, October 2021, and we did this through the use of Qualtrics panels. There's just some demographics here. We largely got a sample that kind of represents Australia in terms of sex and age and jurisdiction across the country. But you can see here that it is skewed quite heavily in terms of, I guess, some of the demographics. So it's important to recognise that. So I guess this is one of the key headlines for the survey, that when we asked those 2010 respondents if they had experienced a data breach, it's almost 30% of people said yes. So I guess the caveat around this is knowing that a data breach has occurred, so either knowing yourself or being notified by a company. So it is potentially likely that I guess the numbers are higher, but certainly there were 595 people in our sample that knew that they had been part of a data breach. 36% of these indicated that they had experienced a financial loss. 150 indicated that they had experienced identity crime as a result of this. 485 had experienced only one data breach, and there was a small number, just over 100, that had experienced several data breaches. And I mean, just thinking back to those three that I mentioned in the last kind of 9 months here in Australia, I do know a number of individuals that were kind of hit by that trifecta, and that's not really a trifecta you want to be part of. So in terms of the information that was breached, it's not surprising. I've highlighted some of the, I guess, the higher categories there. So name, date of birth, email, phone number, and passwords, I guess, were the top 5 as such. Name and email address, I think it's not surprising to see that that was exposed in just over half of the cases. If we think about the type of information that we do generally share with many organisations that we interact with, generally speaking, name and email address is probably, I guess, certainly what I give over the most often. If we think about some of the others in terms of date of birth, phone numbers and passwords, again, I guess it depends on the organisation. It is interesting, though, to see some of the other types that are on there. So driver's licence and passport number. Driver's licence was in a smaller and passport smaller again, but they are quite critical, I guess, pieces of personal information. And we did see in the Optus and also the Medibank that both of them were potentially exposed for a number of individuals, which sparked a conversation around the ability to replace that, because previously it was quite difficult to replace some of these types of personal information. In terms of the data breach, we know that there's just a variety of organisations involved. So, I mean, realistically, we all know that there is no organisation that's immune to this, that data breaches affect both large, small, government and private sector organisations. They do also affect both Australian and international organisations, and that visualisation at the start is a very good indicator of that. In terms of finding out about their most recent data breach, 30% found out directly from the organisation involved. There was about 20% who received a notification through an alert service. And I guess one of the most prominent ones is haveibeenpawned.com, which does provide notifications when information has been compromised. And there was a small percentage that found out through their banks and financial institutions. In terms of the actions taken post-data breach, 61% of people indicated that they had changed their password. 250 people indicated that they checked their credit card and bank statements. And then we see some other, I guess, steps taken in there. It's a little bit difficult to judge around some of these actions because if your password, it's important around, I guess, some of the bigger cybersecurity hygiene aspects. But I mean, changing your password sometimes perhaps isn't necessarily relevant, but I guess it depends what information is out there and what's been compromised. Oh, excuse me. Maybe my voice holds out for this presentation. We did ask a number of questions about the perceived, I guess, about the impact of data breaches. So here you can see the perceived severity of data breach. And moderate, I guess, was probably the most popular at nearly 40%. Oh, struggling now. Not fun. The impact of the data breach. Tom, I might have to get you to take over here.
Sure. So the overall impact of the breach is one of the more interesting things that we considered in terms of the experience of victims. Many of them reported emotional well-being as one of the primary impacts of the breach. Usually when we think about data breaches, the primary focus is on the economic loss to the victim. At least in most Western countries, that seems to be the primary area of interest. How much are victims losing? But what we're seeing here is that in reality, the emotional and the physical consequences are more significant, at least for victims relative to economic loss. That certainly can happen, but it's important to note that victims are experiencing more than just that. There are concerns for their safety, there's concerns for their emotional well-being, and this syncs with what we know to some degree about different forms of online fraud overall, that individuals may lose money, but they also experience negative consequences emotionally and psychologically over the long term, depending on the severity of the experience as well.
Okay, let's see how we go. In terms of, I guess, willingness, kick back in terms of willingness to do future business, we did ask respondents whether, I guess, the data breach had an impact on their willingness to do business with the company in the future. And this was kind of interesting in terms of the breakdown. So there were some that said it had, nearly over half said it had no impact. And that depends on whether or not the breach caused problems or the way that they found out. In reading some of the comments, it was evident that how the company handled the data breach had a significant impact on whether the impact was perceived positively or negatively. So there's recognition in here that it's hard to control hackers, that I guess it's part of life. And so it didn't necessarily impact. But if we look at the next slide, there was slightly fewer that said, yes, it did impact. And for some, it was just around trust, around that they've lost confidence, that they don't trust the company anymore, that they don't feel safe. And yeah, I mean, this is all certainly relevant depending on the experience of the individuals themselves. And as I said, it certainly did seem to correlate with the way that they found out and certainly, I guess, the individual's experience. We then asked about changing views on privacy, and kind of in hindsight, we probably should have asked maybe a little bit of a different question. And we do have some qualitative comments to go with this that we yet to kind of look through. But we did ask people about thinking about the data breaches. Have they changed your views on privacy? And nearly half agreed with that statement. And if you put it together, it's kind of 70% of individuals, 80%, sorry, somewhat agreed or strongly agreed that it has changed their views on privacy. I guess the part we need to dig down is whether it impacted positively or negatively, whether people became more cautious, more aware, or whether, I guess, people became somewhat immune to it. We asked the same question about computer security. And again, there's similar numbers there around those that agreed and strongly agreed that it changed their views on computer security. This one I think is really fascinating, and Tom and I are about to kind of dive into some of this in a bit more detail. But we asked whether people felt they could protect themselves from data breaches. And you'll see here there's about 3/4 of individuals who agreed that they can protect themselves against future data breaches, which I think is fascinating given that the data breaches that they've experienced were third-party data breaches where they didn't actually do anything themselves to be exposed in that. So I think there's something to dig down in terms of the tension, the disconnect that I see there. And we also asked it around protecting the privacy of personal information. And again, we see similar results here and potentially a similar disconnect. Although it's potentially more likely that people feel they can protect their personal information, we do have control over what we share and what we don't. But again, that does depend on the organisations that you want to do business with. There are many times when I've been asked to give over personal information that I'm not comfortable with, but if I don't do it, then I can't engage that company in purchase what I want or get the service that I need. So it's a bit difficult in that way. And then this is another question that we asked again that we're, looking to dive down a bit more deeply in around, I guess, what's broadly termed data breach fatigue, and this idea that receiving ongoing notifications does make people take them less seriously. So if we look at this, kind of 40% and 17% agreed, strongly agreed that it does make a person take notifications less seriously. But then if you put that back with some of the other questions I haven't presented here, when we asked people if they wanted to know each time their data had been exposed, it was a kind of overwhelming yes, I do want to know. So it's kind of, again, a bit of a tension around people wanting to know, but then not necessarily, I guess, being able to process or know what to do with that information. So just wrapping this up, data breaches, as we know, are a common occurrence, kind of inevitable in the current landscape. The impact and severity does differ across individuals, and we saw the majority in this sample set it had a moderate impact, but there was some where there was no impact and there was some where it was quite severe. The view of victims towards organisations does differ depending on their response, and I think that's probably got some good lessons for organisations to know that the data breach itself isn't necessarily going to, I guess, have the worst impact on their customers or on those that have been affected, but it is very much about the communications and how they respond, how they communicate their response around the data breach. That there is a need, I think, to improve support and advice to those who experience breaches in terms of the type of information that's exposed and what to do in the aftermath. And that people's sense of control, for me, doesn't necessarily equate to the actual risk. And I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of this data that we're going to dive into as we move forward. So that's it. That's my contact details. If anyone has any questions, apologies, I have been sick, so I was hoping my voice would hold out 50-50. And I want to thank Tom for being here to jump in when I couldn't, or else it would have been quite awkward. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And I see that James has a question for me.
Hi, Cass, and thanks to you for a great presentation, and to you as well. Thanks, Tom. I guess what I'm curious about, we've had a lot of rolling data breaches happening since your data collection period has ended. I guess my question has to do with, what impact do you think, if any, there might be from these sort of continual rolling incidents that we're experiencing?
Thanks, James. I think it will have an impact. Certainly my observations just being in this space and the media requests that I get for all of these is just that these 3 data breaches, as we know, aren't necessarily unique. We've been having data breaches for decades and many organisations have been impacted. But the size and the scope of these 3 data breaches, particularly Optus and Medibank at the end of last year, they have kind of galvanized public attention in a way that previous ones haven't, in terms of the sheer scale. If you think of 10 million people in a country that I think has about 25 million, that's quite significant in terms of population. It's also focused government attention. So the new Albanese government that we have, I guess not newish anymore, but the current government we have has a Minister for Cybersecurity, which the previous government didn't have. And they certainly, I think, have been more prominent and vocal in their response to this, which again has put it, I guess, more broadly out there in the public. Tom and I are just about to launch a new survey. It's literally in the final, figuring out the typos and the piping for it, where we're going to run this survey again, but only with those that were part of the Optus and Medibank data breaches. So I think it will be interesting to compare some of these questions from 21 with those of individuals who have experienced Optus and or Medibank, to see whether or not there's been a change, to see whether or not there's a difference. We're kind of using it as a case study approach. So I'm interested to see what happens there. I don't know if you want to say something, Tom.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And certainly some of the interest on our part was to understand a little more about data breach fatigue and what inroads we might be able to make just from a criminological perspective. Had we had known that Optus and some of the other breaches were just around the corner, I think we would have structured the data a little bit differently and asked some questions a little bit differently. So I think collecting new data will help. But I would say that one of the critical issues moving forward that we need to understand a little bit better, especially given the magnitude of these breaches, is to what extent are individuals over the long term going to lose any sense of personal privacy? The quantity and quality of data that's lost in some of these things, such as full passports, that's very hard to recover from as an individual. This notion that even if a new passport is issued, that's quite a lot of information to lose. In some respects, it's similar to a breach that we experienced in the US when the Office of Personnel Management was hacked, I believe in 2013 or 2014. And effectively, all of the sensitive information collected for security clearances were lost. And my data was lost in that breach. And afterward, I know personally, I feel like it doesn't really matter whatever happens next because someone has 7 years worth of my residencies and my fingerprints and lots of other information. So that kind of depth may be complex in terms of victim response and government response and kind of long-term attitudinal shifts. So I think there's some very interesting things that we can explore moving forward as a consequence of this, and try to give a little bit better thought as to do victims have agency in these kinds of events? If the breach happens without any fault of your own and the consequences are far-reaching, then what can you do as a victim if effectively the best you can do is hope for information to be reissued? That is a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, effectively.
Great, thanks.
Just,
yes.
Just related to that, that very point. What do you think we need to be doing in terms of monitoring the ongoing impacts of these breaches?
And I think there's a lot of things we can do. For me, I guess there's your general cyber hygiene practices. So, I mean, I get asked this on radio all the time, responding to data breaches, what can we do? And in some ways, there's nothing we can do because we have to keep doing business with these organizations and we have to trust them into the future, although that's kind of increasingly difficult. There's the cyber hygiene aspects around having kind of strong passwords, not reusing the same password, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what it has done in an Australian context is kind of spark a conversation about the collection of information in the first place. So do companies need to collect such a vast amount of personal information? How long do they store it for? Kind of, if we look at some of these data breaches, Latitude, for example, here in Australia, it exposed details of millions of individuals who actually didn't do business with Latitude, that did business with a previous company that Latitude bought over a decade ago. So why was that information still being held? There are a lot of individuals who are former customers who were kind of really quite angry and frustrated about that. So I think for me, it's about having that broader discussion about collecting data and storing it in the first place, and trying to think of ways that we can try and mitigate and minimize the exposure of individuals.
Yeah, great. I think that's a theme we may try to pick up in the panel discussion a little bit later on. Okay, so to our final talk now. And that involves a collaboration between myself and James and others. I'm going to pass over to James to kickstart the talk.
Great. Thank you, Chad, and thanks to everyone for attending today. So the talk we're going to be doing today is about exploring ransomware groups and their activities. This is part of a funded project, received funding from the Australian Institute of Criminology Research Grant Program, which is one of the sort of premier criminology funding schemes here in Australia. A research team led by our fearless leader, Professor Chad Whelan, also our MC, Professor David Bright, myself, our RA, Callum Jones, and Benoit Dupont from University of Montreal. So moving on, please, Chad. Oh yes, before we get into the presentation proper, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are joining you from today. Chad is on Wadawurrung country, I'm on Wurundjeri land, and we wish to pay our respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. Okay, so today we're going to be outlining this project. It's still very much in process, so we've got some preliminary findings to present to you. But really, the purpose of this project is to explore ransomware groups, particularly from an organised crime and a network perspective. So we're going to be trying to apply various organised crime perspectives to examine the activities, the structure of ransomware groups, and to really zoom in on this notion of networks. So we know the ransomware criminal groups are related to one another in various ways, although the relationships remain shifty and elusive. Ransomware groups have a tendency to pop up and then disappear and then possibly reinvent themselves under various other guises. So whether this happens, whether and to what extent this happens is part of our research here, and trying to reveal the hidden connections between ransomware groups and their activities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to go into heaps of detail here. I imagine that most of the people listening in today know what ransomware is. In its most basic sense, it's a form of malware that encrypts files on your computer or encrypts operating systems until a unique key or code is used to unlock that data or device. Of course, that key or code is usually only provided once someone has paid a ransomware, usually in the form of some sort of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin being the really big one here. So ransomware is a pretty old cybercrime. The sort of proto-ransomware was originally developed back in the 1980s. The AIDS or /PC cyborg ransomware. This was, I don't know, it's pretty funny looking at it these days. It's spread on floppy disks. It didn't, obviously this was before the development of cryptocurrencies. So people were supposed to wire money to, to specific account. But obviously it's changed a very, huge amount since then, to the extent to which that it's been identified as the biggest cyber threat across many Western countries, including here in Australia, in the UK and Europol, all of which identify ransomware as the #1 cyber threat, which, when considering the multitude of cyber crimes that are out there, some of which, Cass and and Lennon were talking about just briefly, that's a pretty significant development. The really big developments that have driven this shift of ransomware from a relatively niche problem into the dominant cyber threat are multifaceted. So in the first instance, we've seen the development of a real ransomware industry, which we refer to commonly these days as ransomware as a service. So, back maybe sort of, 5-10 years ago, the majority of ransomware attacks we would see undertaken by single ransomware groups. So, the big names that we know here, you can see down the bottom of the slide here, Conti, DarkSide, Evil Core, etc. And pretty much these groups, while they're sophisticated actors, would also carry out most of the stages of a ransomware attack themselves. So they would, send out big sort of spam emails containing malware, a sort of spray and pray kind of approach. They would gain access to organizations or to even individual systems through the use of the spreading of this malware. And then they would execute the ransomware attack in a relatively unsophisticated manner. They would extort the victims directly, often through automated kind of means. And what we're seeing now is a real devolution, if you like, where many of the tasks and the sort of the scripts that comprise a ransomware attack being carried out by a multitude of actors with increasingly specialized divisions of labor. So the big core ransomware groups still exist. They still dominate the landscape. But what they do now is, instead of carrying out all the stages of the attack themselves, they will, which they do sometimes do, but increasingly they're outsourcing various bits of their activity. So, for example, we know gaining access to victim systems is a critical first component of a ransomware attack. It needs to take place before a ransomware attack can be executed. There's a whole thriving industry of hackers and people who trade in access to compromised victim systems, known as initial access brokers. And these initial access brokers use dark web and even clear web forums where they can sell access to compromised victim systems from all over the world. And so what happens from there is ransomware groups, instead of carrying out all of these attacks themselves, there's a huge target-rich environment that has many more potential victims than the ransomware groups can hit themselves. So what they figured out is a core and affiliate kind of model, which is very similar to, say, like a franchise in the legitimate economy, where you will have the core members of the group, so they will develop the ransomware, but what they'll do is they will license this either for a set fee or for a share of profits to what are called affiliate groups. And those affiliate groups will go out, and they often have much less technical sophistication than the members of the core group, but they will use this pre-packaged ransomware, malware package, which they can then use to target their victims. So that's just a couple of the components of the ransomware as a service economy. We've seen shifts from that sort of spray and pray approach as well, where we had big mass spam emails taking place, to what we call hands-on fraud and big game hunting style attacks. So these involve instead of I've totally lost my train of thought here. Hands on keyboard. Instead of this spray and pray kind of approach, where they would just get through wherever they could, ransomware groups becoming increasingly sophisticated in target selection. So doing reconnaissance, finding out exactly what they need to about their targets, how much money these targets could pay. So targeting big major corporations. And then instead of relying on automated software processes, using hackers to move laterally within organizations to escalate privileges and encrypt as much as possible in these organizations, often deleting backups and so on. We've also seen shifts from single extortion, so that is just charging people to get access back to their data, to double extortion, which is related to the data breaches that Cass and Tom were talking about, where not only would you need to pay money to get access back to your data, but you would also need to pay money to make sure that data that has been exfiltrated by the ransomware groups isn't released, to finally the final iteration of this, which is triple extortion, where we actually see ransomware groups now not only engaging in the first two types of extortion, but also contacting stakeholders. So that might be board members, shareholders of organizations, telling them that a ransomware attack is in progress to maximum leverage pressure on their victims. Obviously, traditional law enforcement has proven ineffective in stemming these kinds of crimes. And given that we're running a little bit low on time, I might save discussion for that, perhaps for questions. So moving on to the next slide, please, Chad. Next slide. Thanks, Chad. Oh, yeah, here we go. Great. So, there are, it seems funny to even talk about this because for many governments have labeled ransomware groups as transnational organized crime groups. There is considerable debate within the criminological space as to whether ransomware groups, and indeed even any kind of cybercrime, can be called and constituted organized crime. To get across some of the definitional confusion here, we've referred to three domains of organized crime activity that have been developed by Von Lamp. So Von Lamp back in 2015 published a really interesting book all about organized crime, and he noted that there were some 200 definitions, or that was not even an exhaustive list of organized crime. Rather than getting into the weeds of all these different definitions, he distilled the key components of organized crime, and that was criminal activities, offender social structures, and extra-legal governance. So criminal activities, these obviously talk about the specific activities that groups are engaged in. Usually when we're talking in the context of organized crime, there's some sort of continual or ongoing operation here of complex tasks, sometimes interlocking tasks that involve significant degrees of planning and preparation. So this is something that we can readily apply to ransomware groups. We saw a recent paper being published on the first crime script analysis of ransomware groups. And there are similar sorts of things that exist in the private industry. So MITRE ATT&CK vector is one of these as well, that demonstrate a dozen or more different kind of stages associated with a ransomware attack, all of which are relatively complex. We've got offender social structures as well. There's a huge variety of here. The good old-fashioned organized crime offender social structure were the hierarchies. So if we think about the Godfather, we'd have a Godfather, various capos, soldiers underneath them. This has since been really developed, even in the context of these traditional organized crime groups. Some of them we can still consider to have these strict hierarchies. Outlaw motorcycle gangs are a good example of that. But increasingly, what we're seeing are market structures and network structures as well. So these are characterized less by enduring relationships, and we get a multiplicity of relationships, shifting networks, between acquaintances, some, permanent, more embedded kind of relationships, and others that can be transitory in nature and characterized just by market interactions. And lastly, we have this category of extra-legal governance. So this is referring to how organized crime groups operate as kind of a shadow kind of government in ways, offering protection, offering regulation, dispute resolution services, and so on, usually backed up by some sort of capacity for violence or coercion to ensure compliance as well. Next slide, please. All right, so the main critiques that we've found in the literature on this, we've distilled into a few different kinds of points here. One of the main sort of critiques that exists within the criminological literature that resists recognizing cybercrime as a form of, or some types of cybercrime as organized crime, is that we found their conceptualization of what kind of structures and what kinds of activities and governance is usually aligned with a very narrow conceptualization that is based on mafia groups. So mafia groups really are an ideal type, and in some ways quite an exceptional type of organized group that engage in high levels of all of the sort of three domains that we were talking about. So very sophisticated criminal activities, hierarchical structures, and also obvious attempts at governance as well. These apply less in a cybercrime or a cyber organized crime context, where network approaches really do dominate here. Violence, regulation, and control of markets. Obviously, this is something that has to work differently in cyberspace. So one of the critiques here is that because physical violence doesn't exist in the cyber world, therefore the groups engaged in cybercrime cannot be considered as organized crime. We argue that this is a really narrow conceptualization. The people who are interested and knowledgeable about cybercrime, there are obviously a range of, offensive kinds of acts that can be engaged in. This could be, cyber attacks themselves, DDoS attacks, or even things that do have potential offline implications, things like doxing, for example, which can result in law enforcement and other kinds of physical harms manifesting in the offline world. These are all things that that can be manifested by cyber organized crime groups, and we would constitute these as forms of cyber violence that have an analogous role in that they can ensure compliance, they can intimidate victims in much the same way as organized crime groups can. And lastly, this question of extra legal governance. Cyber crimes often, because they don't have to do with control of physical territory, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't require control of markets in a similar kind of analogous way. So drug crypto markets are a good example here, where we see usually just a few predominant markets that might operate in a particular territory that might operate, and they will have a market share, often a very dominant market share. And there are various compliance and regulatory sort of things that crypto market administrators do. They sometimes dox people, they can suspend accounts. And given that the majority of trading activity is concentrated usually on one or two, possibly three markets, being kicked out of one of those markets has significant effects and therefore has a compliance type effect. All right, I'm going to throw over to Chad now, who's going to pick up the rest of the presentation from here. Thanks, Chad.
James. So yes, I'm just coming in for the networks component, and we'll talk through some preliminary sort of insights that we have from this point. So just why networks? Networks have been shown to be resilient as a social structure, so they're much more resilient than hierarchical forms of organization, resilient to attempts to disrupt them and internal change and conflict. They are adaptable, which is again part of the resilient dimension when disruption efforts might be employed against hierarchical organizational structures, particularly if those individuals have particular roles in terms of leadership or skills in terms of human capital. Networks are able to adapt much more quickly and easily. They also facilitate learning and trust in ways that other social structures take much longer to do. In much of the cybercrime literature and in the organized crime literature generally, we're sort of finding that networks are fast becoming the dominant social structure. So as James mentioned earlier, the classic sort of hierarchical form of a criminal group or organization is largely oversold, and the reality is much more complex, and networks allow you to unpack that complexity. So networks are both a thing and a method, and what we're talking about for the remainder of this talk is more the method, methodological aspects of network perspectives. So when you apply network analysis, you're able to identify hidden patterns that may not be revealed otherwise. And you can use the social structure, the map of the network to identify particular points of vulnerability, which can inform attempts at disruption. terms of the data for this project, we've used a threat intelligence package from a global cybersecurity company. That tool has a lot of features to it in terms of monitoring networks and monitoring communications in the various aspects of the web, including the dark web. For this particular project, we've searched and extracted all data posted on extortion sites or leak sites from the ransomware criminal groups. For the particular talk, I'm going to focus on that from the perspective of Australia, but the data sample includes all countries in the Five Eyes. So that's Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the US. The websites themselves are sort of, they change, and the domain typically identifies the group involved. So unlike other forms of crime where they may not be wanting to identify who is behind the attack when they post it on an extortion site, they're doing so largely making their identity visible. Whether you can trust that or not is another matter that we'll come back to. So the data includes the ransomware group name, the target name, and we've also searched for the MITRE attack vector, which just gives us a way of cross-referencing what we do know about that event in terms of how they went about the attack and what the outcome of that might be when that data are available. So in terms of method, once we extracted all of that data over the 3-year period that I just mentioned, we then classified each of the target organizations into defined sectors. We've just used in most cases, the standard definitions as they are applicable to stock exchanges definitions in most countries to classify sectors. We've examined the activities of ransomware groups and any interconnections where we can. We've used different ways of doing that, and only some of them I'll touch on now. The data sample, as I mentioned, is there. So preliminary results, just using the extortion site data for 2020, we've identified a number of organizations that have posted events related on their extortion sites related to organizations in Australia. So this map just shows the networks from the Australian perspective. As far as network analysis goes, this is pretty simplistic. It is ego networks based on the groups. So the groups are there in blue, and the target organizations are there in the colored format. So what this just allows us to do is just identify which ransomware gang or group is involved, the number of attacks that they have undertaken in a particular year, and which organization or sector they hit. So here we've seen the majority of those organizations were against the industrial sector, but also high up on the list is consumer goods, technology, and then you move down to healthcare, real estate, financial services, and others. In 2021, the number of attacks increased, again, based on extortion site data only. And you see more of the organizations involved and more diverse range of sectors that have been suffered attacks. Still high up on the list is industrial, technology, and healthcare services. So the larger the blue node there, the more activity that they have undertaken. But still, just from these data, we don't see any intersections between the groups, and those intersections in the context of these network analysis would only apply if the same group hit the same organization over that time period. In 2022, it's again a similar story, just more diversity in terms of the numbers of groups that are involved and the numbers of sectors relatively similar to 2022, with technology being the most frequent sector. Then it starts to become a little bit more interesting when we take a bird's eye view across the time period from 2020 to 2022. And here you see some instances of organisations being hit more than once by multiple groups, not a lot in the Australian example only. You see the different nodes that are there in blue, which again correlates to size. It's very hard to interpret this diagram on its own. So in this table here, we've just outlined, what this sort of shows in terms of which groups are involved, how many times, and which sectors are hit the most. So on the left is the groups that are responsible for the majority of the attacks. The top of the list is Conti, but if you assume that each of the iterations of Lockbit are the same group, so that's number one, Lockbit 2.0 and Lockbit 3.0, they come to the top of the list with more than double the next group, which would then be Conti. The far right just shows which organisations or sectors are hit the most. So just to wrap this up, because we do want to move on to our panel discussion shortly. Just in a couple of brief observations, ransomware group activities have changed over time. What we've really seen is more diversity, and that's been interesting. Some groups have lasted the time period over 3 years, but majority haven't. So what that allows us to observe is that for a number of reasons, the criminal organisations in this space tend to have relatively short criminal careers, and that might be a result of many things, that they have rebranded their own identities over time, or that there has been some change. Target profiles are vary. What we're really trying to figure out is, what these extortion site data allows us to determine about ransomware groups and their activities. And more insights are needed on the internal structure and dynamics of ransomware criminal groups and the relationships between them. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
That was great. I do have a question, if you don't mind. How do you think, given the networks and some of the relationships you mentioned, how much do you think the traditional organized crime literature as it exists can really work to account for the behavior of ransomware groups? They are different functionally. They're even different from some of what we talk about with respect to computer hacker networks, especially those kind of traditional economically motivated groups. So what do you think? How would you respond to that?
James, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Tom, and I think it's one we've all been grappling with. I think that there are, it's one of the things about organized crime, we kind of know it when we see it, but when we try and get into the weeds of different kind of definitions, then things can sort of fall off the wheels quite quickly. There are some things that stand out to me that, make ransomware an obvious candidate to think about in terms of organized crime. One is the scale, sophistication, and impact of attacks. If we think about some of Conti's work, targeting Ireland's National Health Service during the pandemic, or even their more spectacular attack along with Hive, paralyzing the government of Costa Rica. And so we had the world's first national state of emergency declared in response to a cybercrime being committed. This is like Dr. Evil level styles of criminal activity, holding an entire country to hostage, where you've got, like the scale and severity is just it's off the scale, of anything that we've previously associated with cybercrime. It's clearly undertaken by groups who are engaged in, persistent groups who are engaged in very sophisticated attacks. And that also there's evidence now of mediation taking place between these groups. So we've got affiliates and cores. When disputes arise between them, we've got those disputes being mediated by centralized authorities. I think that ticks, all of the boxes that Von Lampe has talked around here. And if we don't have definitions of organized crime that can accommodate sophisticated, persistent groups committing crimes at such a scale as to paralyze a national government, I think our definitions of organized crime will need to shift, or at least become more nuanced to accommodate what we're seeing in the cyberspace. But I'll let Chad elaborate on that further.
I think you've done a good job, and we might pick this up a little bit later. I've just had one question posted. Were there any patterns in terms of the targets selected by each group? Yeah, look, just to answer briefly, because we do want to move on. There were patterns in terms of the sectors that they're hitting more than others, with industrial and technology sort of leading the way. We still need to unpack that a fair bit, because they are sort of broader categories in terms of the numbers of entities that would come under those. We're seeing healthcare ebb and flow over the year, over the 3-year period, and we'll get a much better sort of perspective on all of that when we do the comparisons between the countries in the data sample. Very generally speaking, the numbers of attacks against Australian targets is pretty commensurate with the number that Canada experienced based on extortion type data. The UK is significantly more, and the US is multiples of that again. So we've only really presented a pretty small component of all of that. So we've got about 25 minutes left to join this panel and start this discussion. We had some really big ticket items that we wanted to talk about. We'll see how far we get through those. The kind of themes for that would be essentially based on offenders, victims or potential victims, what institutions such as police and law enforcement and others can do or should be doing about offenders and working with victims and supporting victims, and society as a whole. So I guess I'll just pose some questions to Tom, Cassandra, James, and see sort of how this discussion takes place. The first one is really in relation to the increased diversity of I guess, and the professionalisation of the cybercrime ecosystem, and what we're observing in that space, and whether there might even be other things that we should be observing or monitoring at the moment, such as new tools that are coming out, AI, ChatGPT being one sort of popular example that I know people are using to code and assist with coding. So over to the panel. Anyone want to go first on what we might have to say or offer on this space? Tom.
Sure. I guess I would point to a couple of things. One is the way in which we kind of as a field, criminologists, haven't paid that much attention to the role of nation states in cyber. There's been, kind of tacit discussion that nation states are involved, but we've never really taken the issue to task. There's not good empirical data that I've seen, aside from 1 or 2 studies, that have looked at the way that nation states are engaging in cyber attacks, not only against government targets, but the citizenry generally. And when we talk about state crime, that used to be a point of concern for some criminologists, but we've largely ignored that when it comes to cyber. And I think we do so at our own peril, because increasingly, like with ransomware, there are ties, tacit or otherwise, between individual cybercrime groups and government entities or military or intelligence groups. And so that's something that would, I think, benefit us as a field. And it is something that would be complicated to do, but it would give us some meaningful insights into the ways in which the kind of non-state actor is behaving relative to the state actor.
I'm sure James has something to pick up on that very point.
Oh yeah, Tom, you're speaking my language. This is exactly, so Chad and I we put this paper in about 2 years ago about state crime and looking at ransomware from a state crime perspective. And it ran into problems trying to get published because of exactly the problem you talk about, empirical data. And our argument that we present in the paper is that the empirical data is really hiding in plain sight. If you go to any of these hacker forums, they have very explicit, instructions that you do not target anything in the Russian Federation, and often any even ally of Russia. China will be out, Syria, whomever. But I think even more hiding in plain sight is, people say, okay, well, there's no direct instructions. You won't find a memo from a member of the Russian FSB to, a ransomware group saying target these people, but don't target these people. Our argument in the paper was there's no more direct way of a state signaling what is okay and what is not okay than using imprisonment. So, the government has made very clear, they've not written it down, but anytime a ransomware group makes the foolish mistake of targeting anything within Russia, they are very quickly made a very public spectacle of. They're, arrested on TV, they're given a good kicking, and they're given a really nasty sentence. But that obviously doesn't happen when any Western interests are targeted there. So, in terms of signaling, I think one of the problems is we're kind of hamstrung by what we consider signals in the West. And Tim Mara's book, I think it's Tim Mara's book anyway, about cyber mercenaries, does a really good job of sort of categorizing this and talking about how the cyber affiliates, what he calls them, the proxy groups that undertake sometimes state crime on the behalf of states in the West, they're characterized by private and commercial contracts. You've got Booz Allen, Booz Allen, whatever it was, Edward Snowden's employer, NSA contractor. They have explicit contracts, whereas in Russia, their relationship with their proxy groups is characterized by shadowy organized crime links, where you get these, really obtuse kind of overt signals. But that's the way the business is done there. So I think we need to, as researchers, but also as reviewers of papers, have a more open mind as to the signaling that can take place between states and proxy cyber criminal groups.
Very interesting. Still, if there are ways to get more and better data, that would be fantastic to think through how those sort of dynamics could be explored empirically. Absolutely. Cassandra, what do you think can and should be done to better support victims?
Well, so many things. I guess the first thing I would say is just recognition of the harms of a lot of these different, cyber crimes that we talk about. Because I think we still, and my research focuses very heavily around fraud and the data breach that I presented today, but fraud more heavily. We still have these really strong myths and misunderstandings and negative stereotypes about who is a fraud victim, kind of how fraud occurs, and very strong victim blaming kind of discourses towards individuals. And it's just really problematic in terms of victims being able to seek support, to seek help, and to be acknowledged as victims as such. So if we kind of think about Niles Christie and the ideal victim, fraud victims definitely don't fit those characteristics whatsoever. So I think firstly, we just need to acknowledge the reality of, many of these situations that people find themselves in. I think too, some of the recent work that I've done with Murray Lee on a particular paper looking at fear of crime, and I think is also coming out in this data breach survey data, is I think we've really underestimated the fear and anxiety of the unknown as it relates to cybercrime and to data breaches. So whilst in many ways we can accept to a certain degree the financial impacts of some of these crimes on victims, we're starting to better understand and accept some of the kind of physical, emotional impacts. I think something that we have ignored up until this point, even myself in research haven't really considered it, is this kind of ongoing fear that victims experience that can be really all-consuming for some to try and reclaim a sense of security. So I think for victims of data breaches and for victims of different cyber crimes, whilst the offence has happened in a virtual environment, it's happened kind of in a geographical location that's kind of not close to them, not within their kind of physical proximity, there is a difficulty in being able to reclaim a sense of physical safety and, I guess, online safety moving forward. And that can have impacts across many aspects of their lives.
I'd maybe double click on that a little bit around entities as victims or organizations. Now, we see at some level victim blaming in that context is perhaps used strategically as a tool to, name and shame and so on. Have any observations on that? Anybody?
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, at least if you. Go ahead, Cassandra. I was just going to say on the naming and shaming part, the U.S. has gotten better in the last few years with respect to naming nation states as an example and trying to provide some degree of attribution. If we can't prosecute, well, then let's make it clear these actors are responsible based on these pieces of evidence. And in lieu of prosecution, we're going to try to embarrass and annoy and harass those countries. And it's a strategy, but as a deterrent, it's effectively meaningless. And you wind up with victims who have lost information or who have some substantive harm that has been experienced that will never really be made whole. And that's a kind of glaring problem. And I don't know how we resolve it, but it's of this kind of broader piece of how do we deal with cybercrime, because we understand some of these problems, but we just don't have the tools necessarily to actually affect the problem in a meaningful way.
Right. A lot of the talks that we went over talked about the struggles with enforcement and the limited capabilities of traditional law enforcement. We might pick that theme up, but maybe James might pick it up in what he's about to say now in any case.
Yeah, I'd just like to, echo the comments of Tom and Cass there. I think this is, honestly, I think this is the major problem facing criminal justice today. This is an absolute crisis. If we look at, all of the fastest growing, most economically impactful crimes, certainly in Australia, to which you're likely to become a victim, they're all cyber crimes. And the trends that are driving the growth that we're seeing suggest that this problem is only going to get worse. And yet we know that law enforcement has effectively no capacity, certainly following a traditional criminal justice approach, to meaningfully dent anything here. And so I think that this is a crisis. This presents a crisis of legitimacy, not just for police, but for the state more broadly. The whole rationale, the whole social compact is built on states being able to, monopolize the use of force. But again, we're seeing that break down in a cyber context, in much the same way that the critiques of organized crime say, oh, well, it's not violence because, you're not hitting anyone over the head. We can inflict significant harm, it would be that emotional harm, as demonstrated by Cass and Tom's most recent work. That's the number one thing that respondents are reporting, being hit by a data breach, certainly financial harm, and that could be very long lasting. So, this is a major problem, and states are going to need to come up with more innovative solutions here, lest they face a real, an accelerating crisis of legitimacy.
Thanks. So we talked a little bit earlier about the UN, the potential for a UN convention. I was wondering if it's more an if rather than a when. What observations do we have on that as a potential tool here to try to promote international cooperation? And if we aren't able to construct meaningful mutual international assistance, where does that leave individual countries such as ours?
I'm happy to have a first stab at this. I think the chances of, the UN having some universally agreed upon definition of cybercrime are next to nil. And the reason being always, with the UN is that we have a Security Council that is made up of, maybe not open antagonists, but, people certainly with non-cooperative and sort of grey war zone, events taking place. I think, the development of multilateral treaties definitely is something, and we're seeing this now with the International Ransomware Task Force. But I think what we're going to see is the devolution into a multipolar world where we've got different cyber regimes that are enforced differently. The sort of free liberal West in much the same way as the Cold War. We can see mutual assistance treaties and, like the Counter International Ransomware Task Force. We're seeing China retreat behind its Great Wall. They're not really cooperating with anyone. And then we're seeing Russia, which is very much playing by its own rules. So I think that's going to be the real politic, kind of messy reality of it here. I think, all the rest is very wildly optimistic and unrealistic.
I think too, just jumping in there, that regardless of, and I haven't seen any proposals around the UN Convention, so I don't know specifically what it says, but no convention is really going to overcome some of the logistical issues and the scale in which cybercrime is happening. So the inability of police, even if we can get over the jurisdictional issues, just the resources involved in investigating thousands, if not millions of kind of cyber crimes in all their different forms, and being able to actually investigate them and be able to attribute responsibility of a particular individual who's likely not using their own identity. I mean, regardless of whatever convention you have, there are just some logistical issues that are posed by the internet by its very nature that works in favor of the offenders. So offenders are leveraging all of these, factors that work in their favor. And globally, we're just seeing this dramatic increase in terms of victims. And I'm definitely in agreement with James around kind of this crisis point that we're at, where countries are just seeing cybercrime as the highest category of crime that's happening globally, but just has this complete inability of anyone to respond to it in any meaningful way from a victim perspective.
Yeah, and it seems like you can already see it in some respects with things like, say, GDPR, where Europe has tremendous concerns over privacy that don't extend to the rest of the world, but we're all having to click on cookie agreements and things like that because of the impacts. And even the US with FOSTA and SESTA, these laws that were created to tamp down on human trafficking that have just led those sites to just move to another country and cease operations for maybe 5 minutes and just keep going. So it seems very ineffectual. And just speaking from a US context, certainly the amount of violent crime that we have on a daily basis and gun violence is staggering. And I think people, when you talk about cybercrime comparatively, don't necessarily view it in the same context. So we're even having to deal with issues of what's the more severe offense from your country's perspective? Is it something that creates real and specific concern for your personal safety, or is it something that has substantive financial, emotional, and psychological impact? And certainly both matter, but one has more tangible concerns for the individual as opposed to the other that is more invisible.
James?
Just to build on that point, Tom, I think that's a really, really excellent point you make there. But if you look at this from, say, like a Chinese perspective, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the PRC, but I imagine the cyber crimes that they're concerned with the most actually are the ones that potentially threaten regime stability. So this would be, sharing dissenting views or subversive views, what we would just call in the West free speech. And this speaks to the difficulty of really trying, even if we didn't have these geopolitical conflicts taking place, which of course we do, even just on a values basis, people conceive of what, data security or information security, as is perceived in some of these Eastern regimes, getting everyone on the same, seeing eye to eye in terms of values and priorities, I think is next to impossible on a global, sort of sense.
So that goes back to the UN Convention, I guess, and how they're going to reconcile that in any kind of actual document. What can be done then? I mean, is there a role for offensive operations? Does that potentially change the nature of a policing role in the first place? Anyone want to have a go at that?
I think, for one, it creates some degree of incentive for companies and corporations in the absence of law enforcement action to take steps to deter other countries. In the US, there's been bills that have been proposed about allowing hackbacks. I understand Australia is a bit more advanced in that space than we are, but it makes sense that to some degree we're disincentivizing law enforcement and incentivizing industry to become the key player, because if your law enforcement agencies won't respond in the way that you want, then you have to take appropriate actions to ensure maintenance of your resources and your customers. So I imagine that's probably on the horizon in ways that will only make things worse rather than better. But that's just my take.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, in the Australian context, we haven't had any conversation about permitting others, like the private sector, to engage in hacking back. Or it's much more a sort of state-sanctioned discussion that's sort of unfolding at this present time. But yeah, you can see how in the absence of other opportunities, there would be that sort of mentality unfolding among entities of all types, that if they can't go to the state, then they'll go it alone, and we see a sort of vigilante mentality potentially unfold. No, James, you've got something to say. Over to you, mate.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's very much, the wheelhouse of interest. I think actually the US is maybe closer legislatively to this, because there's a dormant privateering legislation there, going back to the good old days of the pirates, where you could just have, private, organizations going out, you get your letter of marque, and then you can go after your foreign targets. I think that is a distinct possibility, even if it wasn't, though, and this was, to be undertaken, well, I think reasonably to address the volume issue that Cass was talking about, you would need more than just state actors doing this. But it raises the real uncomfortable question of escalation then. And of course, that's one of the reasons that privateers back in, the 1800s were eventually, gotten rid of by all the countries that use them, is because of the lack of sufficient control by the state, and that was provoking outright conflict. So we're entering a dangerous and turbulent new period, and it looks like any of the solutions that certainly I think we've discussed today have severe limitations that are not going to fix the problem.
Right. Well, I'm not sure where that leaves us. Let's talk about the sort of impacts for society then. I mean, we still see more and more people using the internet, more and more engagement with all sorts of activity. Do we think that this message is getting through? Do we think that people are concerned about their data, their privacy, or do we see potential risks around the things that we've talked about, trust and legitimacy, actually potentially play out in people's level of confidence in using and engaging online?
I think there's no easy answer for this. I think in some ways, many individuals have just kind of reconciled themselves to the fact that it's inevitable. So it certainly came through in terms of some of the comments in the data breach survey, that people recognize that these events are inevitable. It's kind of part of life. In some ways, kind of the public health risks that we face in other things, the risks around kind of road safety, all of that, cyber potentially is part of that. And perhaps we just need a greater awareness around some of the threats that are out there and some of the things we can do to try and avoid. In terms of some of the organizations, just kind of taking it back to one of the earlier points around organizations as victims, it was really interesting in the wake of Optus last year, because Optus was kind of largely, there was a critical response to the way that Optus responded to the data breach, the media and everything. But I read an article not very long ago, kind of from someone in Optus reflecting on what had happened, and not really kind of, I guess it didn't come across as kind of taking it very seriously in terms of the long-term impacts for organizations, that it's kind of quite contained. They might lose some value on the stock market if they're listed, but then really it kind of just goes back up to value and people move on very quickly with companies. And we know that some companies have done some really terrible things over the years, and it's really had no impact on their business value or kind of moving forward. And I think cyber's no different in that way. But then I think it was, as Tom said, the victims are still left kind of without any recourse and without any ability to get back something that they didn't lose themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, I hate to be a real pessimist, but I fear that it's only going to get worse. I think about something like AI as an example. You mentioned the various tools that are out there, and instead of really thinking critically about their utility and their value and how they are used, you can read a dozen different articles every day about who's breaking it to do something it's clearly not supposed to do. And we seem to be more than ready to jump on what is the next thing, whether we understand fundamentally or not what it's going to do. And I think that this is going to have cascading effects down the line when we think about the increases in smart vehicle technologies, even with agriculture, the degree of smart resources that are there. There's cyber threats that we really have not even scratched the surface on that are salient. If we're thinking about, say, like food production, these are things that could have dramatic impacts, but we are just more than happy to, how do we simplify? How do we make it easier? How do we make it smarter? And I think about my own kids who have no concern or question as to why social media exists. It just does. And so by default, I should probably use it. And the more we work within that mentality, the more we're opening up ourselves to all kinds of threats and real ones that we won't be able to put back in the box.
I think that's a really important point. And maybe just to offer, this sounds like, maybe trying to find some light where there's all otherwise darkness, that at least in the state of open, conflict that we are seeing around the world, we're seeing things go wrong quickly. At least there's no sort of latent peaceful period where these technologies are being developed, behind the scenes. I think, the malicious actors are trying to use these things as quickly as possible, which sounds like a weird sort of positive side, but at least, I think there are looming threats on the horizon, but we're going to find out about them pretty quickly, and hopefully before they can be developed at such a scale as they produce those, really sort of rapidly, falling domino cascading effects that Tom's talking about there.
Well, thank you. I'm going to have to wrap it up now. Thank you to all of our speakers today, Lennon, who's no longer here, Cassandra, James, and Tom. Thank you to the event organisers. We hope you got something out of this session, and we look forward to seeing what comes out of the rest. That's it.